Once upon a time, in a palace of marble and gold, there lived a girl named Salome. She was born into a world of power and luxury, the daughter of Herodias and the stepdaughter of King Herod. From the moment she could walk, she was taught to move gracefully, to speak with charm, and to always remember that her family's power must never be questioned. Salome's childhood was filled with grand feasts, music, and the whispered conversations of nobles and rulers. She learned that words were sharper than swords, that alliances were built over goblets of wine, and that in the world of the palace, love was often just another tool for control. Yet despite the silks and jewels, the palace felt like a cage. Salome was expected to smile, to obey, to be the perfect daughter. But deep down, she longed for something more, something real. One day, she overheard the servants whispering about a man who spoke in the wilderness, a prophet. A voice that could not be silenced, no matter how much the rulers of Galilee wished it. His name was John the Baptist. "Who is he?" she asked her mother one evening. Herodias' eyes darkened. "A troublemaker, a man who speaks against our house, against me. He claims our marriage is unlawful, that your stepfather is unworthy. He poisons the people's minds with his words." Salome tilted her head, intrigued. "And what does he say?" Herodias slammed her goblet onto the table. "It does not matter. What matters is that he is dangerous." That night, as Salome lay in her bed, she thought about the man who had the power to make her mother so angry. What kind of words could shake a queen? What kind of truth could make a king afraid? One afternoon, as Salome wandered through the palace gardens, she caught snippets of conversation from the guards. "They say he baptizes people in the Jordan River," one murmured. "A wild man," another scoffed, "clad in camel's hair, eating locusts and honey, and yet the people listen." Salome's curiosity burned. A man with no throne, no wealth, and no army held the power to make rulers uneasy. She had to see him for herself. And so, one fateful morning, wrapped in a cloak to disguise herself, Salome slipped out of the palace gates and into the world beyond. The dusty roads beyond the palace were nothing like the marble floors she had grown up walking on. The scent of ripe fruit and roasted meat from the market stalls filled the air, mingling with the shouts of merchants and beggars. Salome pulled her hood lower, careful not to meet anyone's gaze as she navigated the crowded streets. This was a world she had only seen from the palace balconies, a world she had never been allowed to touch. The voices of the people blended into a chaotic hum around her. Merchants called out their wares, offering everything from spices to finely woven fabrics. The poor lined the streets, their hands outstretched for scraps of bread. A group of Roman soldiers passed by, their armor gleaming in the harsh sun, their expressions impassive as they moved through the crowds. Salome kept her head down, moving quickly, following the whispers. "He is at the Jordan. The prophet speaks today. They say he has seen the Messiah." The road stretched beyond the city, winding through hills and dry earth until it reached the riverbanks. Salome had never ventured so far from the palace alone, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. She needed to see this man for herself. She needed to understand why the mere mention of his name sent fear through the hearts of rulers. The closer she got to the Jordan River, the more she could hear it, the voice. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before, deep and commanding, cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd like a blade. "Repent! The kingdom of heaven is at hand." Salome stepped between the people, moving toward the front. Dust clung to the hem of her cloak, her fine sandals already worn from the journey, but she hardly noticed. And then she saw him. John the Baptist stood waist-deep in the river, his hands raised, his wild hair and beard dripping with water. He was unlike the men of the palace. There was no silk or gold on him, no jewels, no tokens of wealth. His robe was rough, woven from camel's hair, tied at the waist with a simple leather belt. His skin was weathered, darkened by the sun, his feet bare against the riverbed. And yet, the people hung on his every word. "Turn from your wickedness. Do not put your faith in power or riches. The Lord is coming, and you must be ready." His voice rang with authority, unshaken, unapologetic. Salome had spent her life watching men of power, Herod, the nobles, the Roman governors, and yet none of them commanded a crowd the way John did. She watched as people stepped forward, confessing their sins, allowing John to lower them beneath the water. A man beside her clasped his hands together in awe. "This is the prophet foretold," he whispered, the voice crying out in the wilderness. Salome frowned. "He is just a man." The man turned to her, his eyes shining. "He is more than that. He speaks of one who is greater, one who is coming." Salome's stomach tightened. Who? The Messiah. The afternoon sun burned hot against her skin as she remained in the crowd, watching, listening. John spoke of things she had never heard before, of a kingdom beyond this world, of a righteousness that had nothing to do with power or wealth. He spoke of men turning away from their sins, of hearts being changed, of a fire that would separate the wicked from the just. "The axe is already at the root of the tree," John declared, his voice carrying over the water. "Every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." The people murmured, some with fear, others with wonder. A man stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What must we do to be saved?" John turned to him. "If you have 2 cloaks, give one to someone who has none. If you have food, share it with the hungry." Another man, a tax collector, hesitated before stepping into the water. "Teacher," he said, lowering his head, "what about us?" John met his gaze without flinching. "Collect no more than what is fair." A soldier waded into the river, his armor gleaming in the sun. "And we? Do not extort money or accuse falsely. Be content with your wages." Salome's pulse quickened. These were not the words of a man who sought power for himself. He did not ask for gold or offerings. He did not bow before rulers. He called for justice, for fairness, for righteousness that had nothing to do with politics. And the people listened. Even the soldiers, even the tax collectors, even the poorest of the poor. It was dangerous. She could see why her mother feared him. Then the crowd stirred. A ripple of whispers spread through them like wind through dry grass. People turned, eyes widening, heads bowing. A man approached the water. He was not dressed in finery, nor did he wear the rough garments of a beggar. His robe was simple, his sandals worn, his presence unassuming. But the people parted for him, as if drawn back by something unseen. Salome could not explain it, but she felt it too. John's eyes locked onto him, and for the first time since he had begun speaking, the prophet hesitated. Salome had never seen a man like John falter, but now, before this stranger, there was something in his gaze. Reverence. The man stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Baptize me." John shook his head. "I am not worthy. You should be the one baptizing me." The man placed a hand on John's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Let it be so now. It is proper to fulfill all righteousness." For a long moment, John did not move. Then, slowly, he nodded. He placed his hands on the man's shoulders and lowered him into the river. The moment he emerged, the sky split open. A light, brighter than the sun, bathed the river in gold. The air shifted, electric with something unseen. A voice, deep and thunderous, rolled across the heavens. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Salome gasped, staggering backward. She had never heard a sound like it. She had never felt anything like it. The crowd fell to their knees. Some wept. Others raised their hands toward the sky in worship. Salome could only stare at the man in the river. He was no longer just a man, and John had known it. Salome left before the crowd could recover, her heart pounding as she stumbled back toward the road. She needed to get away. She needed to push this from her mind, but she couldn't, because for the first time in her life she had seen something greater than the power her mother and Herod clung to. Something real, and it terrified her. The palace was never truly silent, but tonight the whispers felt heavier. They clung to the stone walls, curling through the corridors like mist, murmured by servants who averted their eyes and guards who spoke in hushed voices. The name of John the Baptist echoed through the halls, a name that carried weight, that stirred both awe and fear. Salome had thought that after her visit to the Jordan, after witnessing John's power over the people, she could push him from her mind, but she could not. His words had settled inside her, unwanted, like an ember smoldering beneath the surface. She was the daughter of a queen. She had been raised in splendor, taught the ways of power and courtly manipulation. She had been told that kings and rulers were the ones who commanded the world, and yet John held no title, no wealth, no army. And still, the people listened to him. Even here in Herod's palace, his presence was felt. The tension grew thicker with each passing day. Salome watched as the servants hurried past Herodias, careful to avoid her gaze. She saw the way the guards stood rigid when she entered a room, as if awaiting orders they knew would come. John had been arrested days ago. Herodias had made sure of that. But Salome knew her mother well. That would not be enough. Herodias paced in her chambers, her nails tapping against the gilded armrest of her chair. Her dark eyes burned with fury as she spoke. "This man," she hissed, "dares to speak against us, against me, and Herod, the fool, listens to him." Salome sat near the window listening. Her mother's anger was nothing new, but this time it was deeper, more venomous. "I have heard the people," Herodias continued, her voice sharp as a blade. "They whisper his name as if he is a prophet, as if he is a king greater than Rome itself." Salome tilted her head. "And what does Herod say?" Herodias let out a bitter laugh. "Herod is a coward. He keeps John locked away, but he will not act. He listens to him, Salome. He sneaks down to the dungeon as if this man, this wild, filthy preacher, has wisdom to offer a king." Salome's fingers tightened around the silk of her robe. "Then why not kill him?" Herodias turned to her, eyes gleaming with something dark. "Because Herod fears him, because the people love him. If he orders John's death outright, he risks rebellion. But if John is allowed to live, he remains a threat to us." Salome swallowed. She had seen Herod waver before, but she had never imagined he would be so easily swayed by a man like John. She knew her mother would not allow this to continue. Herodias never allowed anything to stand in her way. Salome could not stop thinking about John. She had only seen him once, in the wilderness, standing in the river with the sun burning against his skin, his voice carrying like thunder over the water. But now he was locked away beneath the palace, stripped of his freedom, his voice caged within stone walls. She had to see him again. That night when the palace had fallen into a restless sleep, Salome slipped from her chambers and made her way through the corridors. The torches flickered against the damp walls as she descended into the depths of the prison. The guards barely acknowledged her. They were used to nobles moving through the palace at odd hours. She walked with the confidence of someone who belonged, and no one questioned her. The dungeon was cold, the air damp with the scent of earth and iron. She followed the winding path of cells until she found the one she sought. John sat in the corner, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes closed as if in prayer. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles, the worn features of a man who had lived outside the comforts of the world. For a moment Salome hesitated. She did not know why she had come. Then, as if sensing her presence, John opened his eyes. He did not startle, did not flinch. Instead, he looked at her the way he had looked at her by the Jordan, not with fear, not with hatred, but with knowing. "You have returned," he said, his voice calm, steady. Salome took a slow step forward, her fingers curling into the folds of her robe. "You speak as if you expected me." John tilted his head slightly. "I did." Salome exhaled sharply. "You think you know me?" "I know the chains that bind you," he murmured. She stiffened. "I am not in chains." John smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. A gilded cage is still a cage, child. She swallowed. She had heard these words before, but hearing them here, in the depths of the palace, they struck her differently. "You speak boldly for a man who will die here," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. John did not waver. "I do not fear death." Salome wanted to scoff, to mock him, but she couldn't. His calm unsettled her. There was no desperation in his eyes, no panic, no pleading. He was at peace, despite the cold walls around him, despite the knowledge of what was to come. "You are not afraid?" she asked. "No," he said simply. She clenched her jaw. "You should be." John studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I have seen the one who is to come. He has already walked among us. He will change the world." Salome frowned. "Who?" John's gaze did not waver. "Jesus." The name sent a strange feeling through her. She had heard it before. The whispers of the people in the streets, the murmurs of something new, something rising. John leaned forward slightly. "Do you feel it, child? The weight of what you have done? The weight of what you will do?" Salome stepped back, shaking her head. "I have done nothing." John exhaled, almost as if he pitied her. "Not yet." Her heart pounded against her ribs. His words unsettled her, not because she feared him, but because she feared he was right. She turned away. "You are a fool," she whispered, though the words felt weak as they left her lips. John did not answer. She hurried up the stairs, back toward the palace, but the echoes of his voice followed her long after she had left the dungeon. The next morning, she sat with her mother at breakfast. Herodias sipped her wine, watching her daughter with sharp, observant eyes. "You went to see him, didn't you?" Salome's grip on her goblet tightened. Why does it matter?" Herodias smirked. "Because now you understand." Salome looked up, meeting her mother's gaze. Herodias leaned forward, placing a hand over Salome's. "He is dangerous, my love, and you must not let his words take root in your heart." Salome did not answer. She was not sure if it was already too late. The night of Herod's grand feast had arrived. The palace was alive with revelry. Torches blazed against the night sky, servants scurried with golden trays, and the air was thick with the scent of spiced meats and sweet wine. Nobles from across the land had gathered, draped in silks and jewels, their laughter rising above the music. The clinking of goblets filled the great hall, and dancers moved in hypnotic patterns, their flowing garments adding to the dreamlike atmosphere. At the head of the room, Herod sat, flushed with drink, his eyes heavy-lidded from indulgence. Beside him, Herodias watched, her smile small but calculating. She had waited for this moment, planned every detail. She leaned toward Salome, her voice a whisper. "Dance for him. Make him see your beauty, your grace. Let him be so mesmerized that he will grant you whatever you ask." Salome hesitated, but the intensity in her mother's eyes left no room for refusal. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The room quieted as she moved to the center of the hall. The musicians picked up their instruments once more, and as the first notes filled the air, she began to dance. The movement was hypnotic, slow yet deliberate. Every step, every flick of her wrist was designed to enchant. The silk of her garments shimmered as she twirled, catching the light of the torches. The guests murmured in admiration. Herod's gaze, hazy with wine, remained fixed on her, enraptured. When she finally stopped, the silence was thick. Then Herod laughed, clapping his hands together. "Magnificent!" he declared. "You have pleased me greatly, child. Ask for whatever you wish, and it shall be yours." A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned toward the young girl, waiting to see what she would demand. Salome hesitated, then looked toward her mother. Herodias, seated beside Herod, kept her expression calm, though her fingers tightened around the stem of her goblet. Slowly, she leaned forward, her voice no more than a whisper meant only for her daughter's ears. "Ask for the head of John the Baptist." Salome blinked, startled. A chill ran down her spine, though she dared not show it. She had expected her mother to request riches, land, or influence. But this was something else. Herodias met her gaze, unwavering. "Do not hesitate, my child. This is what must be done." Salome turned back to Herod, who was still waiting, expecting her to ask for jewels or estates. Instead, she took a breath and spoke in a clear voice that carried across the hall. "I wish for the head of John the Baptist, served to me on a silver platter." Herod's drunken smile faltered. His eyes darkened, and for a moment the illusion of merriment shattered. The weight of his own promise settled upon him, and he realized the trap he had walked into. But he had spoken. He had given his word before his nobles, before his wife, before his guests. And a king's word was law. The order was given. In the cold darkness of his cell, John the Baptist knelt in prayer. His body ached from the damp walls. His hands still bore the marks of the chains that had bound him, yet his heart was light. He had known this day would come. He had always understood that speaking the truth came at a cost. From the moment he had first stepped into the waters of the Jordan, calling out to those who would listen, he had accepted that his path would not be one of comfort. He closed his eyes and memories flooded his mind. The Jordan River, glistening under the golden sun, the crowd gathering along the banks, their voices whispering in anticipation, and then him, the one he had been waiting for. John could still feel the water between his fingers, the way his breath had caught in his throat as Jesus had stepped forward. At first he had hesitated. How could he, a mere servant, baptize the one who would bring salvation? But Jesus had smiled. He had placed a gentle hand on John's shoulder and spoken words that still echoed in his soul. Let it be so now. It is proper for us to fulfill all righteousness. John had obeyed. He had lowered Jesus into the water, and when he rose again, the heavens had opened. A voice, powerful and divine, had thundered above them. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. That moment had changed everything. Now, kneeling in the depths of Herod's palace, John felt that same peace. His work was finished. The path had been made straight. The kingdom of God was near. The sound of approaching footsteps stirred him from his thoughts. The door creaked open, torchlight spilling into the darkness. John raised his head, meeting the eyes of the guards who had come for him. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear, only certainty. John the Baptist, the older guard said, voice thick with something he dared not name. It is time. John nodded once. I am ready. The guards hesitated, as if waiting for him to resist, to plead. But he did not. He rose to his feet, the chains rattling softly as they fell away. He walked toward his fate with steady steps, his heart filled with the promise of something greater than this world. As they led him through the halls of Herod's palace, he lifted his eyes toward the heavens. He had prepared the way, and soon the world would know the truth. Inside the great hall, Salome stood in the center of it all, her heart pounding against her ribs. The air was thick with wine-drenched laughter, the flickering torchlight gleaming against golden goblets and jeweled hands. Herod lounged in his throne, his eyes glassy with drink, his lips curved in the dazed pleasure of a man drunk on both power and indulgence. The silver platter had been brought forth. She had made the request. There was no taking it back now. Salome could feel her mother's presence beside her, could sense the satisfaction rolling off of Herodias like a silent storm. She had done what was asked of her. She had danced. She had bewitched the court, and she had spoken the words her mother had fed her. And now it was happening. The guards entered, their faces grim. Between them, John walked with quiet dignity. His wrists, once shackled, were free. His clothes were worn, his face gaunt from imprisonment, but there was something in his eyes, something unshaken, untouched by the weight of this world. Salome's breath hitched in her throat. She had expected him to be afraid, but he wasn't. He met Herod's gaze as if looking at a man already condemned by his own choices. Herod shifted in his seat, gripping the arms of his throne. He had been so confident, so indulgent, when he had made his foolish promise. Now, faced with the reality of it, he looked like a man who wished he could undo his own words, but a king's oath was law. Herodias leaned forward slightly, her lips parting in the faintest of smiles. "Do it," she whispered. Herod's hand trembled as he gestured toward the executioner. John knelt. The great hall, once filled with revelry, now held its breath. The nobles who had cheered Salome's dance now looked on in silence. Even the musicians who had played their flutes and lyres only moments ago seemed frozen in place. John lifted his face toward the ceiling, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Then the blade fell. The silver platter was heavy in the servant's hands. The blood pooled along its edges, its deep crimson stark against the polished metal. Salome could not look away. Her mother had told her to be strong, that this was justice, that she had done what was necessary. But as the servant carried the platter toward her, as John's lifeless eyes stared upward, unseeing, something inside of her shattered. Herod looked ill. He turned away, gripping the arm of his throne, his face drained of color. The illusion of power, the false security of his rule had never felt so fragile. And Herodias? She smiled. Salome felt her mother's fingers brush against her arm. "Take it," Herodias murmured. "This is what you asked for." Salome's fingers twitched at her sides. Her lips parted, but no words came. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating. She had thought she would feel powerful, victorious, but she did not. She felt empty. With a trembling hand, she reached out and touched the cold silver rim of the platter. A drop of blood dripped from the edge, splattering onto the marble floor beneath her feet. The sound of it echoed louder than the feast had ever been. And in that moment, she knew John's voice would never leave her. Salome said nothing. She felt as though her breath was caught in her throat, trapped between the weight of her mother's words and the truth that burned deep within her chest. This was supposed to be justice. This was supposed to be power. Then why did it feel like something inside her had been severed along with the prophet's head? Herod shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his once glowing confidence replaced by something hollow. He had made an oath. He had carried it through. And now there was nothing left to do but live with it. He stared into his goblet, but the wine no longer had the same taste. Servants hesitated, waiting for the queen's command. But even they, who had witnessed the whims and indulgences of the royal court, seemed unnerved by the spectacle. A few of them crossed themselves in silent prayer. Salome watched them, and for the first time in her life, she envied them. They were servants, low in status, powerless in the eyes of the world, and yet they carried something she did not: peace. A deep, aching void opened inside her. The power she had sought did not make her feel invincible. It made her feel lost. That night, Salome could not sleep. She lay in her chamber, eyes wide open, staring at the heavy drapes that hung around her bed. The torches flickered on the walls, casting shifting shadows that danced in the corners. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Not the severed head, cold and lifeless. The other one. The man she had seen in the wilderness, standing waist-deep in the Jordan River, his voice calling out truth with unwavering certainty. The man who had pointed at her, not with judgment, but with something deeper: pity. She turned onto her side, pulling the silk sheets up to her chin, but the feeling remained. The weight of her actions pressed upon her chest, suffocating. Her mother had told her this was a victory, that she had removed a threat to their family. But it did not feel like a victory. It felt like chains tightening around her soul. Herodias, however, felt no such burden. She sat at her vanity, combing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. The reflection in the polished bronze mirror showed no sign of regret, no flicker of remorse. John had been silenced. The man who had dared to condemn her, to stir doubt in the mind of Herod, was gone. His words would no longer spread through the streets. His followers would no longer rally around him. His voice, once powerful, was now nothing more than a memory. She reached for her goblet of wine and took a slow sip. The taste was richer tonight, sweeter. But as she set the goblet down, she caught the reflection of her daughter in the doorway. Salome stood there, wrapped in a thin silk robe, her face pale in the candlelight. Her eyes, which had always held a flicker of defiance, now seemed hollow. Herodias frowned. "Why do you look at me like that?" Salome did not answer. Herodias set down her comb and turned to face her fully. "This was necessary," she said firmly. "John was a danger to us, to our family. You saw how he spoke against me, how he tried to turn the people against us." Salome's throat tightened. "He only spoke the truth." Herodias' expression darkened. "The truth is a matter of power, Salome, and we hold the power now. You did what was needed." Salome hesitated, gripping the edges of her robe as if she could hold herself together. "Did I?" Herodias sighed, standing from her seat. She placed a firm hand on Salome's shoulder. "You are a princess. You must learn that power requires sacrifice." Salome looked up at her mother. "Then why does it feel like I've lost something?" Herodias' lips pressed into a thin line. She had no answer. For the first time, Salome saw something in her mother's eyes, an emotion she had never witnessed before. Fear. Not fear of John. Not fear of the people. Fear that Salome was beginning to see through the illusion. The palace felt different in the days that followed. The air was heavy, the halls quieter than usual. Herod drank more than ever, though the wine no longer seemed to bring him pleasure. He barely spoke, his gaze distant, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne as though he were afraid to let go. Rumors spread that he had been seeing visions, that John's spirit haunted his dreams. Servants whispered that in the dead of night, they heard the king muttering to himself, gripping his head as if he could block out the ghostly echoes. Herodias dismissed these rumors. "Weakness," she scoffed. "That is all it is." But Salome was not so sure. She had seen the shadows beneath Herod's eyes, the way his hands shook when he reached for his goblet. Guilt, she realized, was not so easily drowned, and neither was hers. One evening, Salome found herself standing in the palace gardens, gazing toward the horizon. Beyond the walls of the city, beyond the desert roads, beyond the Jordan River, there were whispers of another man. A man who spoke of redemption, of love, of a kingdom greater than Rome itself. A man John had spoken of, Jesus. The name carried weight, even in the courts of Herod. Some called him a prophet, others the Son of God. Salome did not know what to believe, but deep in her heart, something stirred. A longing, a hope. Perhaps she thought there was still a way to be free. She turned from the garden and walked back toward the palace, but for the first time she was not sure if she belonged there anymore. The days after John's execution stretched into weeks, but the weight of what had been done never faded. The palace halls felt colder, the feasts quieter, and the once lavish celebrations now seemed forced. Something had changed. The court could feel it, though no one dared to speak of it. Herod was not the same. He barely touched his wine, and when he did, it did not bring him joy. He no longer found pleasure in the music, the laughter, the company of his guests. He had made his decision. He had carried out his word, and yet it followed him like a shadow that refused to fade. Whispers filled the palace. Servants claimed that Herod woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering John's name. Some said he saw visions of the prophet, his severed head speaking warnings only the king could hear. Herodias dismissed it as nonsense, but Salome knew better. She had seen it in her stepfather's face, the regret, the fear, the slow unraveling of a man who could no longer escape his own choices. And deep inside she felt the same. One evening, as Salome wandered the empty corridors of the palace, she found herself standing before the great doors of the throne room. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was dim, lit only by a few flickering torches. Herod sat slumped in his throne, his head resting against his hand. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow and tired. "What do you want?" Salome hesitated before stepping closer. "Do you regret it?" Herod let out a bitter chuckle. "Regret?" He rubbed his face, exhaling slowly. "It does not matter what I feel, child. The past cannot be undone." Salome studied him for a long moment. This was not the powerful king she had once known. This was a man haunted by his own actions, and she understood him more than she wished to. That night, she dreamt of John. She stood in the wilderness, the wind whipping through her hair, the scent of the Jordan River filling the air. Before her stood the prophet, whole and alive, his piercing eyes fixed upon her. "Do you not see?" he asked. Salome opened her mouth, but no words came. John raised his hands, palms open. "It is not too late." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. She awoke with a gasp, sitting up in bed, her heart racing. The torches in her chamber flickered weakly. The night was still, but inside her something stirred. Could it be true? Was it not too late? The next day, Salome walked through the palace with a new awareness. She watched the servants, how they whispered prayers before beginning their tasks. She listened to the people in the streets, murmuring about a new teacher, a man who spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of a kingdom beyond this world, Jesus. His name carried weight, even in the palace. Some called him a prophet, others the Messiah. Salome had never put faith in such things before. Power had always been the only truth she had known. But now, power felt like chains. That evening, she stood at the edge of the palace gardens, staring out toward the horizon. Beyond the walls of the city, beyond the roads that stretched into the distance, there was something more. Freedom. Redemption. Could she find it? Could she leave behind the world she had always known? A breeze swept through the garden, rustling the leaves, carrying with it the distant sound of voices from the city. She took a step forward, and then another, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel like a prisoner. She felt free. The palace would continue without her. The feasts would go on, the laughter would return, and the weight of what had been done would settle into history. But Salome knew that she could not stay. Her mother's voice had once been the only one she obeyed, but now there was another voice, one she had ignored for too long, a voice of truth, a voice of mercy. She did not know where her path would lead. She did not know what she would find beyond the palace walls, but she knew she could not stay. She took one last look at the golden halls, the world she had once belonged to. Then she turned away, and she walked toward something new, something greater, something real.